Welcome to this introductory course about configuration compliance and system hardening. My name is Josh Moulin, Principal at Natsar. In this video, I am going to discuss the importance of configuration compliance and management in cybersecurity, and how to use various free tools, including CIS-CAT Lite and CIS benchmarks from the Center for Internet Security, and the DISA STIGs SCAP tool to harden systems and applications against cyber attack. Thanks for watching. Before you dive in, I wanted to share that you can earn continuing education credit for this content. Just visit natsar.com and register for free to access this presentation. Instructions and a link to access it are available below. Upon completion, you'll receive a certificate of attendance, which can be used toward continuing education hours. It's our way of giving back to the cybersecurity community. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date on our latest videos and other resources to aid you in your cybersecurity journey. Also, feel free to explore our on-demand courses and other valuable cybersecurity resources at natsar.com. The objectives for this course is to understand the importance of configuration compliance in enhancing IT operations and cybersecurity, explore industry standard benchmarks such as the CIS benchmarks and DISA STIGs, and understand their application in creating secure configurations. Gain practical knowledge of building and deploying hardened system images to meet organizational security requirements. Develop skills to scan and assess systems for compliance using tools like CIS-CAT and DISA SCAP. And understand strategies for monitoring, maintaining, and updating configuration compliance to address evolving threats and requirements. In this course, I'm going to go over some of the background information and classroom part that you should know, and then at the end I will also do a demonstration of both the CIS-CAT Lite tool and the DISA SCAP tool. Let's jump in. Introduction to configuration compliance and baselines. Configuration compliance helps us ensure that systems are consistently configured across the organization. It also helps reduce vulnerabilities by applying security best practices and reducing things like unnecessary services, ports and protocols, and other things that you just don't need open or active in your environment. And it also helps support compatibility and operational stability. So when I'm talking about configuration compliance, what I'm really saying is that you should have all of your systems configured very similarly. Now, there will be outlining systems that have to have some changes, but for the majority of our purposes, Windows 10 or 11 desktops and laptops should all be very close to the same. Our servers that we deploy, whether they're Linux or Windows, should be very much the same. And even our switches and routers and other devices should have a very standard configuration baseline of what settings are enabled or disabled and how things are set up to really help us as an organization be more efficient and effective. And particularly in security, there's a lot of advantages to using things like configuration compliance baselines, which we'll talk a lot about here in just a minute. It also helps us maintain consistency. As I mentioned, your desktops and workstations and servers should all be very similar. They may have different workloads, and maybe one or two or a few settings might have to change, but for the most part, they should all have very consistent setups. It also helps us ensure compliance with organizational policies and regulatory requirements. So if you're under some sort of regulated industry that has to deal with HIPAA or CJIS or NIST CSF or one of these other frameworks, there are certain requirements at times where things must be turned on or turned off or disabled some other way or mitigated, that having secure policies pushed to your systems can help you get to that requirement. It also helps us streamline management and reduces the risk of configuration drift, meaning that once you set up systems in the way you want them to be set up, you can scan to make sure they're staying in the configuration that you had intended. And if not, you can certainly get reports about that and go fix it. But if you know that every Windows 10 workstation is set up this way, then you can easily see if a system isn't set up the way that you had intended. We also sometimes call these configuration baselines images, or sometimes you'll hear them called gold disks or gold images, really meaning that this is our gold standard. Once we build the image the way we want with all the configuration settings that we need, we then make a copy or an image of that, and that becomes that gold image. And we'll talk a lot more about the practical steps that organizations take and why it's so important to have these. Now, baseline configurations can be created for more than just computers. So you would have baseline configurations for things like operating systems. So your Windows desktops and laptops and servers, your Linux systems in your environment, even Mac OS systems have benchmarks available for them. But on top of your operating systems, also your applications, your databases, your web servers, your internet browsers, all of those, even Office productivity suites like Microsoft Office and others have benchmarks available, and they all have security settings you should be thinking of as far as what should be turned on. For instance, should you allow macros to run in Excel? Probably not. Those are examples of things that you're going to go through and set up. Now, this is generally done by a cybersecurity organization working with IT, defining what those requirements should be. Then there could be some things layered on top of that, such as regulatory or legal requirements that you must comply with. But then there's some give and take with the business also, because you may say, we absolutely cannot allow macros to be ran in Microsoft Excel. And then you find out that because of something that was done 10 years ago, if you turn macros off globally across your entire enterprise, it breaks some system that finance is using, and you get a bunch of complaints from the CFO. So there are times when you have to go through and make exclusions, or you have to set up special groups. So maybe these computers in your organization can run macros, but everybody else that doesn't need to can't. And you could even scope it down even further where they can only run macros from these documents or things that originated within your organization, for instance. And you could even put other mitigating controls on those systems to make sure to reduce the risk of compromise because of the ability to run macros. Now, that's just one example with the macros, but you can see that kind of where I'm going with that and how you could use that for other things. And then also, it doesn't just go to our computers and servers, but even infrastructure devices like your firewalls, your routers, and your switches all have configuration files. And when you're in a larger enterprise, you can push these configuration settings to your routers and switches and desktops and servers through various administrative applications. So all of these things that I've just talked about, operating systems and applications and even network infrastructure devices, have configuration settings that we want to make a baseline of, so we have that known good state that we know is secure and works in our environment. There's a number of benefits for having these baseline configurations. First is just rapid deployment. It's nice to know once you have an image of, let's say, a Windows 11 desktop, you've created it, and again, I'll walk through how to do this, but you've got it, you know it works. Now when you go out and buy more desktops next year, instead of having to set up every single one individually, you just deploy this known good image that's secure, it's locked down, what we would call hardened, and it has all the system settings and applications on it that your organization needs. You can deploy that very rapidly. It also gives us some security assurance. We know that these configurations are good, they work, they're hardened, so we've got some assurance with that. Operational efficiency, of course, it just simplifies our system management and creating updates, and it also helps reduce errors. You don't have inconsistent systems that are just all over your network that don't have the same settings. From a cyber and an IT operational perspective, having inconsistent systems is very frustrating and very hard to manage. So let's put this into practice. How baseline configuration may work in an organization is here on this slide, and I just wanted to give you something that many people will be doing, and that's a Windows 11 desktop. So let's say your organization uses Windows 11 and you want to create that known good gold disk image or baseline configuration of a Windows 11 system. First, you would start with just a vanilla Windows 11 install, meaning it's the default configuration from Microsoft. You install it on your system, and once it's installed, then you would do a full update. So you run all the Microsoft patches and updates necessary. Sometimes that takes a number of iterations of downloading and rebooting, but once it's totally done, then you would join it to your domain. Now, if you're in a networked environment, business class environment, joining to the domain means you have to have domain administrative credentials. You would join it to the domain. It would then inherit a number of policies called GPOs or group policy objects to the device. And it's everything from security settings to what the desktop background may look like. And there's almost unlimited number of settings available for GPOs. It really depends on how your organization uses them, but joining the domain should get those policies pushed to the device. Once that's done, you want to make sure all business applications are installed that your users are going to need. Things like Microsoft Office, Adobe, Chrome, whatever else that you might use. Get those installed and also update all of those. So check for updates, make sure they're fully patched as well. Then you'd want to put your security tools, if they're not already getting pushed by GPO, then you would install those, making sure you've got your endpoint detection and response or EDR application on there, your host-based firewall is enabled, and the rules that it needs are pushed down to it. And any other enterprise security tools that you need should be on the device at this time. Then you want to test everything, and this can take a while. You would generally have an IT team that's dedicated to this, where they're going to make sure everything can communicate with everything else, that all the applications work to the best of their knowledge, how the users might need to, that database connections are set up, everything that needs to be done seems to be working. Once you have all of that completed, then the next step is to confirm with cybersecurity that all of their requirements have been deployed. So usually this is a little bit of a give and take where IT will do a lot of this work, but then there's an information security or InfoSec or cyber team that also has input into what security settings should be part of this gold disk image or baseline configuration. So you want to make sure all of their requirements are built into this too. Now, once everything is installed and tested and has been updated and patched and confirmed that it's working, you'll want to take an image of that system. And there's a lot of software tools out there that will do this. Sometimes, like with a switch or a router, you may just go up and say export configuration. It could be just as easy as that. But with desktops or Linux servers or other systems, you actually create an image of the fully functional operating system. And then IT management tools allow you to deploy those images to multiple systems and change the bits and pieces that need to be changed so the network doesn't think it has a bunch of duplicative systems on it, but it'll go through and change the computer name and do any licensing changes that need to happen so they'll all actually work for the users once you deploy them. Now, once you've done this, this image now becomes your standard Windows 11 build. We know it's free from malware because we started from the very beginning. All the software has been updated, patched, our settings work, our policies have been deployed. So we really want to protect this gold, that's why it's called a gold disk in many organizations, that gold disk image, because it's critical for our success. Now we can redeploy that rapidly to new systems when they come online, or sometimes you have a system that needs to be reimaged because it's had a glitch or it was compromised in a cyber attack or something happened to it when you need to just reimage that system. We would always want to use that gold disk or baseline configuration that we know is good to do that reimaging. And it's much faster when you do it because you're starting from a known good space. Now, of course, there's always a delta between when you took the image and when new updates and versions and patches come out. But if you start from a known good and then you just have to apply patches, that's much faster than starting from scratch every single time. Continuing with our Windows 11 desktop example here, it is best practice that the IT team will occasionally update the baseline configuration. Now, you may say, I don't have an IT team. I am the IT and the cybersecurity person, and that's totally fine. And this all works even if you don't have an enterprise where you can push things to systems through group policy objects or other things. You can do this one at a time. Maybe you have a small office of 4 or 5 computers. You can certainly do this with that too. So don't feel like this is only applicable to large enterprise systems and networks, because that's not the case. But as I mentioned, the IT team or whoever should be doing occasional updates. And what you want to do is maybe quarterly have a calendar invite that reminds you that it's time to get that gold disk image back out of storage, install it, because it is a known good. We don't have to worry about that being compromised or anything. And then running patches and updates and everything you need to do to get it back up. If there's been any issues from the last time you've deployed it, maybe something wasn't quite configured correctly or a new connection needs to be established, you can make sure all of that's done. You want to keep change logs of those types of things. And then once you've got all those things done and you've tested it, you snap a new image. And now that becomes your new gold disk, the other one goes away or it gets archived somewhere. And if you do that quarterly, then you'll be set up pretty good for any time that you need to do things in between those quarterly snapshots that you take. You want to make sure that anytime you do these updates, that standard baseline is all that you start with. You don't really want to go back to scratch. And again, you can have multiple configuration changes applied at that group policy object or GPO level, as well as doing this with the gold disk or baseline configuration images. There is a life cycle to all of this, and as the slide shows, starting with yellow, we want to define our organization's configuration compliance standards and requirements. So that really starts there. As I mentioned before, IT has a say in this, information security or cybersecurity has a say in this, and then of course your business requirements, legal requirements, all go into this definition of what your standard configuration should look like. Then we deploy those. So we create that gold disk baseline configuration, we deploy them to the assets that need this, and we want to monitor the performance and take note of anything that didn't work so well so we can update our baseline configuration. Then we want to use a tool to scan our enterprise for compliance with our baseline configuration settings. And we will get into that in just a little bit on how to do that. But just so you know, at this point, it's possible to have applications, there's a number of them out there, that can take either the CIS benchmarks or the DISA STIGs and scan your enterprise for compliance against your baseline configuration and give you a report about any of that configuration drift that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, we want to update those baseline configurations, as I mentioned, maybe quarterly, and make sure that you document those changes and you securely store those configuration baselines so we don't have to worry about them getting compromised. And I'll talk more about that later too. Now let's talk specifically about tools such as the CIS benchmarks and the DISA STIGs. There are two primary sources for configuration benchmarks. Now you can create your own manually. There's nothing wrong with that or nothing that says you can't do that. But as you'll see as we go through here, that would be a lot of work because there's a huge number of settings and configuration changes that can be made on operating systems and software applications. So I don't recommend doing that unless you're an expert in this area and really want to. But I recommend starting with a pre-built configuration benchmark, whether it's from the Center for Internet Security, CIS. I'm a bit partial to the CIS benchmarks because I was a senior vice president at CIS and their product is globally known and recognized and is great. I'll walk you through that. Then the other source primarily is the DISA STIGs. It's the Defense Information Systems Agency, DISA, Security Technical Implementation Guide, or STIG. DISA STIGs are designed for Department of Defense or DoD systems. So usually they're only used by DoD military organizations or contractors that do work within the defense industrial base. So for the most part, most of you listening here are probably going to opt for the CIS benchmarks, but you may, for whatever reason, decide you want to use the DISA STIGs, or maybe you have to use the DISA STIGs. Now, there's also nothing that says you cannot customize these. So for instance, you could start with the CIS benchmark for Windows 11 and apply that to your systems and then realize that certain things don't work for you. Maybe you need, because of some legacy software, you can't go quite as strict on a particular setting as CIS might recommend. So you can back off on that and then make that your particular configuration compliant. So when you do scans, while CIS may say that should be turned off, you might say, well, for us, it has to be turned on. So when you scan it and you see that it's on, don't count it against us. And one thing that you may want to get in the habit of doing is documenting any of these exclusions that you make. So then if you're audited, if you're in a situation where you might get audited for IT and they say, well, best practices says that needs to be off, you can say, yes, you're right. We have to leave it on, and here's the business justification for doing that. And you have it all documented. That's a really good way of doing business. And if you can do it, I would highly recommend doing things like that. And then generally there's no questions other than maybe, well, what's your plan to remediate that or to eventually upgrade so you don't have to do that anymore? That may be as simple as you'd have to talk to the business owner because they need to upgrade their application before we can turn this on or off. I mentioned the CIS benchmark, so I'm going to go through each CIS and DISA STIGs just to give you a little more information about them. So if you're not familiar with CIS, the Center for Internet Security, it's a global nonprofit organization. The neat thing about CIS is they use this vast range of global subject matter experts, volunteers, to create these benchmarks. So they have groups that work on every different benchmark. And of course, CIS has full-time staff that really manage this and do a lot of the production and publication of these. But the global volunteer pool helps say, yes, maybe they might say, that's a good idea in theory to turn this on or off, but in practice, because we do this every day, it just doesn't work. Or here's a way you can still meet the security objectives, but also meet the business objectives by doing some different thing. So it's really vetted with IT and cybersecurity professionals around the world. They're also part of a larger group of offerings from CIS, including what most people think of when they think of CIS, which is the CIS controls. Those 18 standard cyber hygiene controls that most people talk about when they talk about cybersecurity controls is produced by CIS. And the CIS benchmarks and the controls fit very nicely together. The benchmarks are also updated quickly, and they cover a range of systems, applications, and cloud platforms. And I'll show you some examples of this. On the right-hand side, I have just a screenshot of the CIS website where their benchmarks are. And you can get to this by going to cisecurity.org/benchmarks. And you'll be able to see all the various benchmarks that are available for download. Now, the DISA STIGs, as I mentioned, is focused on securing U.S. Department of Defense systems. They're very detailed and also very strict settings, as you would imagine, securing military-grade information systems. Usually these are required to be used for anybody within the DoD or connected to the DoD networks. And also some defense contractors may also have to have their systems set to these DISA STIGs. They're not updated as quickly as the CIS benchmark, so sometimes you'll see, for instance, Mac OS 13 may be the most recent one that's available for STIGs, but CIS has already got OS 15 published. So in some cases I've seen from my federal experience, I used to be a CIO and a CISO within the National Security Organization in the federal government. We would generally use DISA STIGs for our systems. However, if there was a delta between when the last DISA STIG was published and then, in my example, maybe we had Mac systems out there that had upgraded to OS 15, but DISA only had 13, we would generally opt either to see how much of a difference is between 13 and 15, and can we just use the DISA STIG for 13 on the OS 15 version, or should we use the CIS control in the absence of no information available from DISA? And that's what we see a lot of times on the federal contracting side and even the federal government side is if DISA doesn't have anything published, then CIS would become the de facto second place to go to within that DoD environment. Here's an example of a CIS benchmark that can be downloaded for free in a PDF version from the CIS website. I have just a couple screenshots here taken from the over 1,300 pages of just the Windows 11 standalone system, meaning it's not on a network or connected to an enterprise network. And the way they do this is they go through every single setting and they have a bunch of information about it. So on the left-hand side here, you see their standard here, 1.1.2. Ensure maximum password age is set to 365 or fewer days, but not to 0. And then it talks about the profile applicability, so what level of risk, gives you a whole description about what the setting actually means in layperson terms, and gives you a recommendation for what the setting should be. And then on the right-hand side, this is all part of the same standard, but this tells you how to go check it. So while there's tools, and which we'll go over in a minute, on how to automate this checking, you can also just go to either a registry key or a file system location and check to see whether or not this condition exists on your system. So on the right hand side, that tells you where to go to check it, what the default value is, what the value should be that you're going to be setting it to if you're going to comply with this benchmark. And then it also tells you which implementation group or IG that this relates to based on how risky your organization is. So the CIS controls differ from the benchmarks. Those 18 controls are broken into 3 implementation groups. Now this isn't a course on security controls necessarily. It's more about these benchmarks. So I won't get too much more into the CIS controls, but that's why you'll see this IG1, IG2, IG3 is it's talking about if you're part of implementation group 1, this will help you comply with those requirements based on your risk profile. So every organization should comply with IG1. That's the basic cyber hygiene that everybody should do. IG2 is for organizations with more risk based on a risk assessment. And then IG3 is the highest level. So those are the organizations that have the most amount of risk and should comply with even tighter security controls. So this gives us a little bit of information about how these benchmarks align with those controls. Now here's an example of DISA STIGs for Windows 11. So apples to apples here on a Windows 11 system. The unclassified version of DISA STIGs can be downloaded at no cost from their website in XML. So while CISs are nice because you can just look at it as a PDF, and you could manually go through and do all those changes on a system, the DISA STIGs don't have that nice PDF view, but instead they have an XML format, and they have a free tool called the STIG Viewer, which I'll show you in just a bit also, that's available on DISA's website. Now, DISA refers to this as the XCCDF, or Extensible Configuration Checklist Description format, that they use for their STIGs. So on the right-hand side, this is kind of the same information that I showed you previously on CIS's website with their PDF. On the right-hand side here, this is the Windows 11 STIG that I have opened within their STIG Viewer, and it gives me all of those same control settings, what the default value is, and what their requirement is for a DoD system to have that particular setting set to. All right, now that we've talked about configuration baselines and benchmarks and how those work, let's next talk about how you would actually scan a system for compliance. Along with the CIS benchmarks that are no cost, CIS also offers a free software tool called CIS-CAT Lite. CIS-CAT is the CIS configuration assessment tool. As I mentioned, it is a free assessment tool. It allows you to scan either your local system or a remote system against CIS benchmarks. It is limited though, so this free tool is part of their larger suite that they call Secure Suite. They have a software tool that's essentially just like this, but it allows you to scan against any benchmark called CIS-CAT Pro. With this free version, CIS-CAT Lite, you can only scan against pre-configured benchmarks that they've allowed. So I believe it's Windows 10, Windows 11, Chrome. There's a few others that you'll see in the demo when I get to that it will allow you to scan against, but it's not going to allow you to scan against all the various benchmarks that CIS has produced. To do that, you would need CIS-CAT Pro. But CIS-CAT Lite is perfect if you're just trying to scan your own Windows 10 or Windows 11 computer, for instance, to see how you compare to the recommended best practices for cybersecurity. Or if you're even in a business organization and you have just a few systems that you want to scan, you can certainly use something like CIS-CAT Lite. I mentioned they do have that paid application called CIS-CAT Pro, and CIS-CAT only runs on Windows systems. So at this point, there's not a Linux or a Mac executable that you can use to run this. It has to be done on Windows. You can get CIS-CAT Lite from going to the URL that I have below the screenshot there on CIS's website. DISA also has a free tool they call SCAP. It's Security Content Automation Protocol that allows you to scan either a local system or a remote system for compliance against whatever DISA STIG that you're trying to use. They do not have the limitation like CIS does, so you can download any DISA STIG and use their SCAP tool to scan against it. So it doesn't give you just a few, you can use it for whatever. Now again, DISA does not have as many benchmarks or STIGs as CIS does, but if they have one that you want to try, you certainly could use their tool for free to scan for compliance. Now remember, DISA STIGs generally are more restrictive than CIS. So for small and medium businesses, even large businesses, STIGs may just be too much, but it could be a place for you to at least start and see how many of their recommendations you could use without breaking things within your environment. When you generate this report, just like CIS-CAT Lite, when you do a scan of your system, which you'll see here when I do my demo, both of these tools give you a very nice detailed report of your percentage of compliance against the recommended benchmark and what are the areas that you passed and failed, and then gives you hyperlinks to click through there and see For instance, what you failed, why you failed it, and how you could fix it, and the implications of doing so. You can get the SCAP tool at the URL that I have below the screenshot on this slide. Let's switch now to talk about the maintenance of your configuration compliance baselines, your gold disk images, whatever you want to call them, and how we might be able to use these during a cybersecurity incident response activity. Now that we have those configuration baselines created, we have to protect them sufficiently. If we think about the CIA triad of cybersecurity, confidentiality, integrity, availability, this is really focused on the I, the integrity of these backups, of these configuration baselines. We have to make sure that they are protected against alteration and that we don't have to worry about attackers not only getting to them, because there would be a lot of valuable information in there for them, but also that they're not changing them or injecting some malicious code inside of them. So one thing that I did when I was a CIO in the federal government was I created a network attached storage area that was highly restricted, had an access control list of who could get in there, and we also monitored for accesses and alerted on accesses because it wasn't often that people needed to get in there. But this location stored all of our configuration files, and we encrypted the files as well as they sat there. And only a certain number of people had the key to be able to decrypt those files. So what we would do before we put them in this area is we would create what's called a cryptographic hash of the backup files. So for instance, let's use a Cisco switch as an example. You could go in and export the configuration file once it's all set up. The switch has been upgraded with the latest firmware. You know it's working. You export that backup file, the configuration file. We then create a hash value of that file and we document what the hash value is. If you're not familiar with hash values, you definitely want to do a quick Google search on that. But hash values are a series of letters and numbers that represent mathematically the contents of the file, and even changing one little character of a file will completely change that MD5 or SHA-1 or whatever hashing algorithm you use. It'll change that value. So the benefit of doing that is once we export that config or we scan an entire hard drive that contains our Windows 11 known good image, once we have that hash value, we can then securely store that backup file. And then if we ever needed to get it out for any reason, doing a restoration after a cyber attack or something like that, we would hash the configuration file we just got out of our storage, compare that hash value with the hash value we took when we first made it. And if those two values match, we know that at no point has that configuration file been touched or altered in any way since the time we made it. That's very important because I have seen organizations before where they were taking backups of things and they didn't do it the way we talked about here, where you set that quarterly appointment and you only update your known good image. I've seen some people instead get a little lazy here and just back up images of systems that are currently running in their environment and then redeploying those. The problem with that is if those systems are compromised when you created the backup, you could potentially back up the malware or whatever the intrusion point is, and then redeploy the infection to your entire network. So that's why you really want to use known good backups. And if you have those hash values taken, when you redeploy, let's say, configuration files to all your switches, you know because of your hash value that what you're deploying is good. You don't ever have to worry about that being compromised from some sort of adversary. When you restore those configuration files, whether it's because of a cyber attack or because you just had a system crash, again, you don't ever want to reinfect your network, so make sure that those configurations are clean and sufficiently protected. If you do have to do a restoration, make sure you hash that configuration baseline and compare it to the ones that you have stored, so you know that what you're giving back to the user or deploying in your network is clean. And then I also recommend maintaining change logs for configuration file updates, and also assign this to someone. This is all great, but if no one's actually doing it, it doesn't matter. So I would actually have people, I had a network team, and in that team, I had one primary and one backup that their job was to create quarterly backups from just the way I've been explaining it, create a change log of the changes they made, do the hashing, do the encryption, store the configuration file. And then I also had people that would go audit to make sure that that work was actually being done. On my desktop team, they did the same thing. On my server team, they did the same thing. On the infrastructure team, they did the same thing. So we had quarterly backups of all of these things being created, hashed, and we had to deploy regularly for any number of reasons. And never once did we have an issue with all the things I discussed. Does it take a little bit of time on the front end? Absolutely. Does it save a lot of time on the back end and a lot of heartache? Absolutely. So if you can do it this way, I highly recommend doing that. There are some other benefits of configuration baselines that aren't really intended for why people create those, but they're a little bit parenthetical to what we're talking about and just good information that you might want to know. Most of this has to do with incident response and forensic investigations. So in an incident response, when an analyst has to look through a hard drive, let's say, to see how did this computer get infected, or how did the compromise occur, or what was the way that the adversary got in, they have to look at hundreds of thousands of files on a system. Everything from system files that just come with Microsoft Windows to all the users' files and temporary files, all of those things are on there. One nice way to just cut a bunch of noise out is by creating what's called known file filters. So let's say, for instance, back on our example of a Windows 11 system, that you start from scratch with that vanilla Windows 11 operating system, and you install all of your business applications, and you patch it and you update it and you get it ready to go, and it's been tested, and you've taken your snapshot, your gold disk image of that Windows 11 system. At that point, you know that every file, and that's even going to be hundreds of thousands of files, you know that all of those files are good. You've installed them from good sources. You know that they can be trusted. Well, why would the incident response or digital forensic analyst want to see those hundreds of thousands of files that are already good? Well, they really don't. So what you can do is you can hash all of those files and create this directory of usually MD5 hashes for every file. So the registry, the Windows operating system, Microsoft Office files, install files, all of those things you create a hash value of, and you give it to your digital forensics and incident response or DFIR team. They can then put that into their tools, whatever enterprise forensic tool that they're using, and say, when I look at an image from one of my Windows 11 desktops or Windows 10 or server, whatever, exclude, don't show me all of the ones that are known from the hash values. And that immediately takes off the table all of those known good files. What that then allows the forensic analyst to do is close the aperture to only look at things that have been altered. So the hash value would change if something's been altered. So that could be very important. And things that are new or different from the original, which there's going to be a lot of them. Sometimes just as the system creates files like event logs and prefetch files and other things, those of course are going to be shown to the analyst because they're new, but we want them to see that. And there's going to be a lot of system attributes and artifacts that they don't necessarily need to see, but they will be present. But then they can focus on, well, what are the things that the user has generated? What are the things that maybe an adversary generated? What are the new items that have been created on this hard drive? And then they can use their general standard forensic processes to really narrow that down even further. But this is a huge help to them because they don't need to see all that other noise. It really does rapidly reduce just the amount of data that they have to look through in their investigation. Now I'll start with a demonstration of CIS-CAT Lite and how you can install this and use it on your computer. We'll first start by downloading the CIS-CAT Lite software from the CIS website. And once you have that downloaded to your system, it'll come in as a compressed zip file, just like you see here. I'm going to expand the zip file, get to the contents of that folder, and then we will begin our execution of it. All right, now that that's done, it expanded this folder for me, and I can just double click Assessor and you'll see all the files here. And I'm just going to launch the GUI.exe. It says CIS-CAT Pro, but because it's the Lite version, it's narrowed down where you can only use the benchmarks that you'll see here in just a bit that they have authorized. Okay, now that it's been launched, We can pick either advanced to scan remote systems or basic to scan just our local system. For this example, I'm just going to pick basic and scan my local system. So if this was SCAP Pro, we would see all the benchmarks that CIS has to offer that we could scan against, but in the Lite free version, there's only a couple. So we have Windows 10, Windows Server, Chrome, Windows 10 Enterprise, so for obviously business or organizational enterprise environment, standalone just for a single Windows 10 system, Windows 11 benchmark, and then they have Ubuntu LTS benchmark here. So I'm going to pick just the Chrome benchmark because I have Chrome installed here. We could also pick the Windows 11 Enterprise. Even though my system isn't connected to a domain, we could still try that, but I'm going to do the benchmark just because it'll be fast for demonstration purposes. In the profile, I'm going to select is just the L1 corporate enterprise environment general use. I'm not going to do the high security, high sensitivity environment, although you certainly could. And then I'm going to add that. This takes it here, showing me that I'll be selecting the Google Chrome benchmark version 3 at level 1. I can change the temporary path where it's going to store files, but I'm just going to leave it the default and click next. And then in the Lite version, I just have an option for an HTML report, which is fine. Anyway, the destination will be within that extracted folder that I put on my desktop, which is totally fine. And we could do various things with logging. I'm just going to leave this default, but if there were errors that were found during the process, you could see what those are. Now, one thing you could do is save the configuration file. So if you do a number of customizations here and you want to reuse that customization in other scans, then that's what you would save this. Once you get it all set up, you could save it as an XML customization file and then use that configuration for other scans. But for this purpose, I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to click next, and I want to start my assessment. And it's going to go through a number of checks. As it goes through, it'll tell me that it loaded the benchmark and it connected to the target, which is the local target, so it shouldn't have any problem there. The assessment is started, and then it'll go through all of the actual checking that it does to compare my system with the best practices defined in the benchmark. All right, it just took a few minutes to get that done. Now it tells me I have a report that's ready to view. Now I could either go to the folder in here in my desktop and the reports folder that was created and click there, or within the program I can just hit view HTML and it's going to launch the report. So here is the report that's generated by CIS-CAT Lite, and it tells me my computer name, my IP address, and then I was using CIS Google Chrome benchmark version 3 and the settings, and it said it took 28 seconds to do the actual assessment. So now I could scroll down and see all the checks that it made, whether I passed, failed, or if there was an error. So we had no errors at all, no unknowns. And you see I have 10 checks that I passed, 66 that I failed. Now this is just a default installation of Chrome. I've done nothing to try and secure it or harden it, so that does not surprise me. And then I can go through here and see more information. I picked that level 1 general use, and it gives me more of a description about what that is. And then now I get into the actual results. If I want, I can say only show me CIS controls. Remember I mentioned the CIS controls earlier, the implementation group, or IG1, which is just essential cyber hygiene. So if I check that, it's going to scope down things that are only applicable to IG1. And I can also say, I don't care about the things I passed because I've already taken care of that, but let's just see the things that I failed. So I'll leave it on there, and now it shows me all of the controls that I have failed based on the best practices in the CIS benchmarks. So I will go, let's just pick one here, ensure disable saving browser history is set to disabled. So if I click this, it tells me that the Google Chrome browser is configured to save the browsing history, but the recommended state for that is disabled. It gives me a note, this setting will preserve browsing history that could contain a user's personal browsing history. Please make sure that this setting is in compliance with organizational policies. the rationale behind the change. Browser history shall be saved as it may contain indicators of compromise. To establish a remediation configuration via group policy, so those GPOs I mentioned, where you can push this out to your users. Set the following UI path to disabled, so it gives you the full path here. And then whether there's any impact expected on the user behavior, and the references for where this control comes out of. So now I could go into Chrome, and if I don't have an automated way to push these changes, I could just manually go into Chrome and change all of the settings that I want to be able to get a better result. And that's one nice thing with this too. I'll just scroll up. Sorry for the scroll there. I can go here, I can look at these, and some of them I might say, yeah, that's a good idea. I'm not going to do it for whatever reason. Or I can try and change as many of these as I can and then do another scan, save that report, and I can compare the percentage that I had of passing scores in the first scan versus the second. And I can keep doing that until I get it where I want it. And then I can save the final scan as an artifact of my configuration compliance against the CIS benchmarks. And that's something you could use for audit purposes, and any other changes that you want to make in the future, you'll know exactly what your settings are. And that's really it for this tool. You can scan, again, the operating system, the browser. If you have the paid version, then you can scan a number of benchmarks that's available on CIS's website. You can get CIS-CAT Lite on CIS's website. They have a little video here that describes it in more detail, but I've pretty much shown you everything. And then the CIS benchmarks, this is CIS's website. So if you just go to CISsecurity.org/CIS benchmarks, you can see everything here. And as I mentioned, the free version of CIS-CAT just has a few benchmarks, but if you really look through all of the various benchmarks they have available, it's quite an impressive list. So we could click desktop software, for example, and see Firefox and download the Firefox benchmark. Now remember, even though you can't use CIS-CAT Lite to scan all of these, you still can download the benchmark as a PDF and manually go through and set something up. Now the other thing you could do, let's say for Firefox or any of these, Microsoft Office, Windows, Adobe, you can go through and manually change all the configuration settings on, let's say, Firefox, Chrome, Adobe, Windows. And then when you're done with that, then take that baseline image, your baseline configuration, your gold disk, once you've implemented manually all the CIS controls, and then you know you've hardened the operating system and all the applications using these best practices, and then you could deploy that out that way too, if you didn't need to pay for or wanted to pay for the tools from CIS to push it out. It does save you a lot of time though, and it's in the big scheme of things, if you're a business, it's not that expensive to be able to do that. But there are other tools. If you're already using a vulnerability scanning engine, for instance, many of them connect with CIS's tools, and as part of their package, the vulnerability scanning tools that you may use, it may be able to scan for configuration compliance and also help you on some of the remediation to improve your passing rate. So that's everything with the CIS benchmarks. We'll next look at the DISA STIGs. Now we'll look at DISA's SCAP tool the same way. I'll do a demonstration and show you how you can use it on your system. We looked at the CIS product, CIS-CAT Lite. Now we're going to switch to the DISA STIG product that they have. So this is public.cyber.mil/STIGs. First thing I want to do is download their STIG viewing tool. I'm going to go down here to STIG viewing tools and download their latest version 3.4 for, I'm on a Windows, so I'm going to download the Windows version, and Windows 64. And then, so we've got that downloaded. Let's also download or look at the STIGs. So we'll go to Document Library and then look at all the STIGs that they have. I'll expand this to 100 entries, and you can see they've got all sorts of things: Active Directory, Adobe Pro, Akamai, Apache. The list just goes on and on and on for all the different software tools they have for these configuration benchmarks. So because we did Chrome with CIS controls, I'm just going to search for Chrome here. Now you can either just download the STIG benchmark in an XML view, so it's not as clean for native viewing like CIS where they provide the PDF benchmark. DISA provides it in XML, or we can download the STIG plus some related help documents. I'm just going to pick this one because it's going to give us some additional information. So now I have a STIG downloaded and I have the viewer. So I'm going to minimize this, go to my downloads folder real quick. And I'm going to put these two on the desktop. I already had the Chrome STIG apparently. So let's extract these so we can take a look. Actually, the STIG we don't need to extract. We can ingest that as a zip file. So we'll get this MSI package opened here. Okay, so we've extracted the STIG viewer, and I'm just going to click on the viewer and open it. All right, so now we can view different STIGs. So I had already looked at a Windows 11, so I'm going to close that out. You shouldn't see that if this is a brand new install for you. I'm going to open, go to our desktop, and I'm going to click on the Chrome STIG and hit load. And it said it found one STIG. So here's the STIG that is in this format. So it gives us some PDFs, the overview of the STIG itself, if we want to read more about what DoD has done with this. And it gives a README and a version history. And then we can start clicking on the actual checks. So they've got a rule ID, it's an unclassified STIG here, the category is severity. Here's the rule title, firewall, traversal from remote host must be disabled. Has some discussion about why that is. Here's the check text. So if you wanted to manually do this, you could go to the address bar, type Chrome : / policy, and then look for these things. And we can just go through all of these and see the different things that the DoD has decided should be in here. So this is, again, the STIG viewer. It doesn't scan our system, but it does allow us to look through the STIGs, and we can load any of those STIGs that you saw into this. There's not a restriction on which ones you can look at. So I'll go back to their website, and now let's look for the SCAP tool, which is under automation. This is the tool that will allow us to actually scan our computer for compliance with the STIG. So I'm going to download the actual tool, and I'm going to get the, let's see here, got to get the Windows, there we go. So you see they have them for Ubuntu, Unix, Solaris, all sorts of different operating systems. Obviously we're on a Windows system now, so that's what I need. Go to my downloads folder, and just drag that over to my desktop. We will extract this. And then we're going to set this up. Now this is something because Windows doesn't know about the developer, DoD, but we're going to go ahead and run it anyway. We know we got it from a trusted source, and we can always check the hash value of the download to make sure it has matched. Since it came from the Department of Defense, I think we can trust this, but always checking the hash is a good idea. I'm going to accept the agreement and install the content. Put a desktop icon. So you just click through there. I'm going to close this out and minimize the STIG viewer. All right, now we have it installed, so I can open up the SCAP compliance checker. All right, we got the SCAP compliance checker open. It's going to do a scan to see if there's any new software that it needs to install. It'll do that automatically. And I'm going to close this. Okay, so it has all of the various tools here. You see for Windows, which is all we have here because we're on a Windows system, but here's the applicable ones. We've got Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, OneDrive, Windows 11, Firefox, Defender. You can see all of these here are available for us. So I'm going to uncheck everything except for Google Chrome. It tells us here the title of it and the profile when it was released. So a lot of good information here if you're interested. And as far as scanning, it's pretty simple. I'm going to do a local scan. I'm not going to connect to a remote machine, although that is possible. And I'm just going to say start scan. And it's going to tell me that I can enter manual questions. Sometimes with these, it can't scan for a technical control because it's an administrative control. So it may ask you something like, do you have a written policy that prohibits XYZ? And when you answer yes, then it will score you accordingly based on your word of what you said. So obviously there's some benchmarks both for CIS and for DISA STIGs that require your input. For now, I'm going to just continue the scan and worry about the technical issues just for the purposes of this example. And you can see it's starting to gather information. It's going to start scanning my machine. And then much like CIS, it's also going to give me a nice HTML report. So that's it. The scan is done. I can click View Results, and I'm going to double click this one that I have here. Go down to Reports, and I'm going to say All Settings, and double click that. And now it opened this HTML report up for me. So it says I got a 0%. So not great, obviously. I failed 40 checks. Again, this is just a vanilla Google Chrome installation, and it gives me some information about my host here and the information about the STIG that I used, and then I can start getting into the actual systems settings that failed. So I can just click here to take me down. So again, very much like CIS, gives me the rule ID. It was an automated test, it failed. It tells me why this is an issue, the description, and I can go down here to the actual tests and where I could go to make the changes. So it'll say, you know, it's checking for something and the value must be set to 0. It also gives me the actual registry key where I could go to make that change if it's not something I can make just within the software itself. And then you can see it just goes on from there. These are all things that failed on this check. So you can see by default, there's a lot of work to be done to harden Chrome, for instance, but the same is true for Windows or Firefox or anything else, that you would then need to go in, start making the changes, doing testing to make sure it didn't break anything in your environment, rescanning, and getting up to as high of a score as you can. Now, generally, no one gets 100% because there's going to be things that, while from a security perspective they look good, from a legitimate business use case perspective, it just may not work. So remember, I mentioned before, have those exclusions of, we did not do this rule for this reason, and document those, attach it to this report. So if you get audited, you can say, here's our our automated scan report, here's our list of exclusions, so you can see why we didn't do some of these things. And I've been through many, many audits like that, and the auditors really appreciate it. It kind of stops the questioning. They may ask you to say, well, I want you to turn it on and then show me that it truly breaks whatever. And you can then do that if you need to. But generally, if you have a pretty robust cybersecurity program and they've seen other things that you're doing correctly, they're not going to ask you to go that far on that. So that's it with DISA STIGs and CIS-CAT Lite. I hope you found this short course helpful. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thank you.